the American offensive in 1917, with all these hundreds of thousands of American troops arriving in Europe and joining the war, is often mentioned as one of the reasons for why the Entente managed to win the war. The British sacrifice in Somme and many other places is also often mentioned, but for some reason we do tend to forget just how many French soldiers sacrificed their lives in the First World War and how staunchly they resisted. But it is true that during the last months of the war, the war fatigue in France was enormous. And in the years after the war, there was this national debate going on just how much they had lost during the war. And it created this environment in which, well, later, as it was said, in the lead up to the Second World War, who is prepared to die for Gdansk or for Danzig?
Well, indeed, because we forget now, because it's we don't think about it necessarily, that for the people making the politicians making the decisions in the run up to the Second World War, were people whose family members, who were probably, some of them had fought in the First World War. One thinks particularly of British Foreign Minister Sir Anthony Eden, as he became, who not only himself had fought in the First World War, interestingly had fought in the same sector as the front of Adolf Hitler, but who himself, I think, lost two brothers in the First World War. And many other politicians were similarly afflicted. So you can understand how they would have seen firsthand the horrors of war and would have done almost anything as they tried to avoid this being repeated again in their lifetimes. And as a postscript, Anthony Eden lost his only son in the Second World War. So you know, people say, oh, appeasement, weren't they terrible? But you can understand why, if you've been through something terrible like the First World War, you would not want to inflict that on your population a second time in less than a generation.
Naturally, psychologically, it all makes sense. However, if you are a great statesman, which naturally every statesman should aspire to be, then you also need to have foresight, and you have to have what the Germans call Fingergespitzengefühl, that you can feel with your fingers the small details that are necessary in world politics. One of those opportunities that were lost was in 1934, when naturally Hitler's rhetoric before coming to power was clear to everyone. He had been one of the leading forces launching, or the leading force actually, launching the beer cellar coup in 1923 in Munich. Throughout the 1920s, he had his rhetoric of wars of aggression, enlarging the German living space, or the Lebensraum, as the Germans called it, in Eastern Europe, taking revenge for the Versailles Treaty and not adhering to the Versailles Treaty. So this belligerent rhetoric from Hitler, and his general, well, insanity and just absolute full-on aggression was clear to everyone. So when his party came to power in 1933, everybody knew what they could expect from this man. He also very quickly did prove that it wasn't just rhetoric. He did start to withdraw Germany from these provisions of the Versailles Treaty, started building up an army again. And in 1934, that founder of modern Poland, Józef Piłsudski, he knew what was coming. So he contacted the French and offered that the French and the Germans, the French and the Poles should conduct a preemptive strike against the Germans and remove Hitler from power, and thus neutralizing this threat. At that moment, the Germans really had no army that could oppose a joint, well, they had no army that could oppose just a French attack, but a two-front assault from Poland and France would have meant that Hitler would have been gone from power within 2, 3, or 4 weeks tops, and the bloodshed would have been minimal on all sides. Unfortunately, that was an opportunity that was missed. When the French declined the Polish offer, this is when the Poles realized that no preemptive strike would come, and instead they would have to try to somehow live with Nazi Germany as a neighbor, and thus they signed this Treaty of Non-Aggression in 1934. However, returning to these Soviet plans, with this aggression being built up, apart from the occupation of the Rhineland, you later had you had the retaking the Saar area, you had the Anschluss of Austria, and then finally you have the Munich Agreement as well.